So, welcome to the Oxford Clay Pottery Podcast. I'm Catherine Tomlinson and I started an eco conscious pottery company called Oxford Clay. Now, at Oxford Clay, I don't just make pottery, I also make resources such as books and courses and information for other potters who want to be more eco-conscious in their pottery practice but maybe don't know where to start or can't find out the information they need. So that's what this podcast is all about. It's about sharing everything I've learned along my eco-conscious pottery journey with you, and I can't wait to get started. So let's go. Hello, welcome back to the Oxford Clay Pottery Podcast. I'm your host, Catherine Tomlinson, and in today's episode, we're going to be talking about reclaiming clay because you might think that you need like specialist equipment to reclaim clay, but you don't. And I'm going to tell you all about it and tell you how I do it, and you'll see it's something that is like totally available to anybody who works with clay. So essentially, reclaiming clay is turning clay that is either too wet or too dry back into a usable state. Okay, so it could be like either taking away water by sort of drying it, air drying it, or it could be, adding water. So if you think about all the different ways that we like make pottery, it could be like from the wheel, could be all that like that slurry kind of thing that comes off the clay as you're making the pot. We can reclaim that. It could be like offcuts, say like you've made a pot like a slab pot or something, and you've got some like leather hard clay, and you can't like roll that clay out again. It's already it's drying, it's too dry. We can reclaim that. We can reclaim pots that have like gone wrong, where you're like maybe they've started to crack, or maybe there's something that's like you've accidentally knocked the side of it and you're like, no, it's gonna then warp in the kiln, and it's a dry pot, it hasn't been fired yet. We can reclaim all of these things back into usable clay. So it's a really cool thing to do because it means that your clay is essentially infinitely recyclable until it's fired. So when you fire clay, it changes the molecular structure of the clay. So it cannot then be turned back into like wet clay. But up until that stage, if it's like literally any stage of clay, like, from slip to bone dry clay, you can reclaim it back into usable clay. So that's why it's so good. It's so good to reclaim clay because it's just like it enables you to just like keep on using that clay resource. It's never going to run out. As long as unless you made something and fired it, you can just keep on using it. Keep on making stuff out of it, and then keep on reclaiming it if you don't like it or it goes wrong or whatever. Okay, so let's talk about how you actually reclaim clay. Okay, so when I went to pottery evening classes, they actually had specialist equipment that they used to reclaim clay. So they used to have like a big plaster bat, they used to call it, which was like basically a big slab of plaster that used to draw the water out of the clay. So they used to put like very wet clay onto the plaster bat, and then it used to like dry it out, and then they would reclaim it. They would put it through another piece of specialist equipment which is called a pug mill, where they used to kind of put the clay in the top and then like switch the pug mill on, and then it used to kind of come out as these like compressed like clay kind of sausage shapes that then they used to chop up and then store in these big like metal bins and stuff. So that was a way of them, reclaiming a lot of clay for those pottery classes. The technician used to do it there, and because reclaiming clay can be sort of like quite sort of heavy work. So it's great. Their pug mill was great. It would like compress it into like much more usable shapes for people to then wedge up like. Knead, wedge, and then like use in the pottery classes. So I'm just here to tell you, you don't actually need those two specialist pieces of equipment. You can reclaim clay just with, I'll tell you how I do it in a minute. You can literally just lay it out to dry. Okay, so I'll tell you how I reclaim clay. So what I do, okay, so when I was learning how to like reclaim clay, just from in my own pottery, I read some books, and some of the books were saying that the best thing to do when you're reclaiming clay is to let it all dry out completely and then to add the water. And that they were saying that this is a really good way of like making the clay very even, because it all then there's this pottery term called slaking down, which basically just means it all kind of disintegrates at the same rate, at the same, it's all kind of, you get this like, lovely consistency of the clay, because you don't get like hard bits and too soft bits, and it's all kind of slaked down exactly the same, and then you can reclaim it easier from then. Okay, so I suppose that is like the textbook way of reclaiming clay. So if you were going to like teach someone maybe how to reclaim clay, they'd be like, look, dry it all out, then slake it down, then you can reclaim it. But I actually don't do it like that. So I actually just chuck everything in a massive plasterer's bucket. So I've got this really cool, really strong plasterer's bucket, which they use in the building trade for like mixing plaster. I basically have one of those, and I just chuck everything in there. Like throughout the months I'm using different bits. So it could be like bits of dry clay, it could be like water with clay in, it could be pots that have gone wrong. So kind of like, just normal wet clay. I use offcuts from slip casting, which have a deflocculant in, which is the chemical that's used to make slip really runny. So I just chuck it all in, basically. Just chuck it all into this plasterer's bucket, and then I just leave it. And I often actually leave it for a really long time. So in this textbook as well about like how to reclaim clay, it said reclaim little and often, and it's a really good idea because it can be quite demoralizing when you get like a huge buildup of clay, and I can really relate to that. But what I've found is that it's a really good idea for me personally to reclaim clay during the summer, and that's just because it's much easier to dry the clay, and yeah, it's just so much easier. Things just dry so much faster in the UK in the summer. So that's when I do most of my clay reclaiming, and then I then make stuff out of that wet clay. So I can do pots on the wheel. I roll the clay out, make like coasters and little kind of wall hangings and stuff. So that's what I mainly use my clay for. So I'm interrupting this episode to tell you about a totally free guide I've made just for you, on how to make your own pottery glaze recipe. So if you are a total beginner to glaze making and it's something you've wanted to maybe try, but you're not really sure where to start, this guide is specifically designed to take you through all the steps you need to know from start to finish, all the ingredients you need, all the equipment you need, and also how to fire your pottery glaze at the end. So, even if you're not new to glaze making and you just want a pottery glaze recipe that's very simple and specifically made with eco conscious ingredients, then this guide is also for you. So, you can get the guide in the show notes, there's a link, but also you can go on to the Oxford Clay website at www.oxfordclay.co.uk/resources for potters. Okay, let's go back to the episode. Okay, so what I do, so when I've chucked it all in this bucket and left it for months on end, I then basically scoop. When I think, yeah, right, it's time to reclaim the clay now, I basically just use my hand, scoop it all out, and put it onto a tea towel. So um, yeah, I just put it I scoop it out, put it on this tea towel, and then the tea towel helps to kind of like absorb some of the very, very wet clay. So it's all kind of gone into the consistency of kind of um there's a lot of water in there. It's like kind of sloppy clay. If you imagine like a really sloppy wet clay that's much too wet to use, if it's not that consistency, I add water until it's just very, very sloppy, so it's kind of like extremely wet clay. But I will be able to like scoop it out, and I just put it on this tea towel. And then what I do is I just leave it to dry. So I leave it to dry for maybe a couple of days, and I'll come back to it, and I'll kind of just kind of move the tea towel around. So good having it on a tea towel because I can just then, and you can use any cloth for this, any nice like flat cloth. You can then fold the sides of the cloth like in to kind of make sure the edges aren't drying too fast, and to kind of knead it a little bit inside the cloth, and it won't stick to the floor because it's in that cloth, and it won't stick to the cloth because you can just peel the cloth off. So it's like, yeah, that's like a massive top tip for like reclaiming clay, is just put it on a cloth. um yeah, I thought about telling you some kind of reclaiming clay fails that I've had as well, because I thought that might be quite good. So you can see the kind of different iterations of process I've gone through to try and reclaim my own clay. So, okay, so the first way I used to do it was I used to get like a board, like just a wooden board, and I would put it outside. So I would just put all this clay on and I would leave it outside. And I was thinking, oh, this is great, it will dry really fast. And, it'd be great to have it like in the wind, in the sun. But that was actually not a good way of doing it, because what would happen was like the edges of the clay would get really dry. They would get like too dry and basically go back into like hard clay, and then the middle of that big mound of clay on the board would be totally wet. So it would dry really unevenly. The classic clay drying unevenly problem was like applying to that mass of wet clay. So that was like, yeah, it just didn't work. It was like the middle was too wet, the edges were too dry. I'd have to reclaim the edges again, like put them back in the bucket again. Yeah, so then what I did was I thought, "Oh, okay, well, that's drying too fast. Maybe if I cover it in plastic, the whole thing will just dry out, like, nice and slowly and evenly." And I still was doing it outside. So did that work? No, it didn't work, because the plastic basically stopped the clay from drying at all. So I would still get this issue where like the edges of the clay would dry really too fast. So I'd dry it for like days and days just outside. And then under the plastic, it would be like totally wet. And then like around the sides where like the plastic wasn't quite, tucked in enough, it would go completely dry. So my absolute top tip for reclaiming clay is just to do it like in a temperate environment, preferably inside somewhere, on a cloth, and that's basically all you need to do. Just literally scoop it out, scoop that wet clay out, put it on a cloth, and yeah, it's going to be fine. It's going to dry. So okay, so that's basically step step one: scoop it out, put it on a cloth. um, the next stage is basically to leave it, like I said, for a couple of days. That's step two. So yeah, I basically check on it every sort of day or so, just to see how it is. Like if it's drying too much, I'll kind of fold it all in on itself, just so the edges don't dry too fast. Yeah, like I said, that's why it's so good having it on a cloth. Okay, and then step three is when you think it's kind of, I always take the clay and do this when it's like the kind of the slightly wetter side than usable clay. So when you think it's kind of got to that stage, it's quite nice to have clay which is a tiny bit too wet to work with, just because that clay will keep on drying out as you're kind of wedging it, like as you're kneading it and as you're going to store it. So it's quite good to have it on a slightly wet side. So what I do is I then when I think it's dry enough, I will basically like take it into kind of balls of clay, like that I've got the strength to kind of wedge or knead. So I'll wedge it, kind of kind of a big chunk of clay that I would normally, the kind of maximum I can wedge basically. I would take that and I would wedge it on top of a cloth. And this is really good because if your clay is like a little bit wet, it will absorb the water, keep on absorbing the water, and it will, the moisture from the clay, and it will stop the clay from like sticking to whatever surface you're trying to wedge it on. So if you're wedging it on like, like a table, any kind of shiny surface or something, that clay's probably going to stick to your table. You're going to have to like scrape it off, with like a, I don't know, plastic card or something. So it's really good to wedge that clay onto a cloth just whilst you're kind of just kneading it. Just want to get it kind of even, you don't want to wedge it like, you don't need to wedge it like loads and loads, because you're going to be storing that clay. And before you use that clay, you're going to wedge it again really, really thoroughly to get any air bubbles out. But at this stage, you're literally just kind of incorporating all of the different drynesses of that clay. You just want to kind of get it back to that usable state. So yeah, so doing it on a cloth is so good. Okay, and then the last phase, the last stage, stage four, is basically just storing it. So that's kind of it. That's it to reclaiming the clay. And I store my clay in a kind of plastic storage container, which I just got from the supermarket. They have, if you want like a storage box, say like you want to store something under the bed or something, or like in a cupboard. I use these plastic boxes and they are so good for storing clay. So um, You could store your clay in anything that's airtight. You could use Tupperware if you're just reclaiming like small amounts of clay. You could, like I said, in the pottery, they use these like big metal bins. In the evening classes I went to at that pottery studio, and they would have like lids, and then they would kind of have plastic. You could fold in the plastic, to keep the clay dry. Just really wanted to keep it. You just really want to keep it dry. You don't want it to dry out. Spend all that time reclaiming it. You don't want to have to reclaim it all again. So just kind of like keeping it wet enough for you to then like work with. And like I said, just make sure you wedge it really well before you actually use it, because lots of air bubbles get incorporated into that into your clay as you're reclaiming it. It's all kind of air bubbles coming in everywhere and all. Yeah, so it's really good to kind of make sure you wedge it really, really well before you use it. And that's everything really. That's it. That's how you reclaim clay. So yeah, it's been so nice talking to you about how to reclaim clay. That's my sort of number one top tip is really just to kind of, well, do amounts that feel manageable to you in terms of like, how much you want to be like, kneading, wedging that clay. I kind of do about a tea towel's worth. And then my absolute number one top tip is just to tip that clay out, scoop that clay out onto a tea towel. And yeah, it's a perfect surface for drying clay out in a temperate environment, preferably inside, away from like wind and sun. Um, yeah, and that's everything. So that's all you need to know about reclaiming clay. You can do it. Yeah. Yeah, it's been so nice talking to you on the Oxford Clay Pottery podcast about reclaiming clay, and I'm really looking forward to seeing you on the next episode. And until then, wishing you very happy reclaiming, reclaiming clay, potting, and yeah, I'll see you soon. Okay, bye. Oh, yeah. So I hope you enjoyed that episode. And if you're interested to learn more about eco conscious pottery or making your pottery more eco conscious and sustainable, there's so much for you on the Oxford Clay website, which is www.oxfordclay.co.uk. I can't wait to see you there.